So, before our gospel reading today, Jesus has been doing wonderful things all around the Sea of Galilee. He's been healing, he's been preaching good news, calming storms. He's been doing what you might call miracles. And Jesus is getting a following. He has a crowd that's continually pressing in on him and on his disciples every day. They're overflowing the houses where Jesus is. They're crowding the beaches where Jesus preaches. And they're following him on boats whenever he tries to go out on the water. Jesus is becoming well known. He's becoming a bit of a superstar. And then, today in the gospel, he returns to his hometown. As a different translation called The Message puts it, he gave a lecture in the meeting place, and the people from his hometown said, "Wow, we had no idea he was this good. How did he get so wise all of a sudden?" And in the next breath, they were cutting him down. "He's just a carpenter, Mary's boy. We've known him since he was a kid. We know his family, his brothers, his sisters. Who does he think he is?" And after that, something strange happens in the gospel. If you're a reader in the 21st century, knowing who Jesus is, something that we don't expect. Jesus then is not able to do any deed of power in his hometown. He manages to heal a few people, which of course seems like a big deal to them, but he can't do what the gospel says are deeds of power. So when I read the gospel, I think, what's the deal with that? How can Jesus just lose power when he's around people he grew up with? Does it have to do with them saying, he's just Mary's kid, no big deal? Maybe. Now, I want to be clear that I don't think that what we do or do not do causes Christ to lose power. I think God continues to work in the world. God's power through Christ continues no matter what we do, even if we think Jesus isn't a big deal. So why does Jesus not have deeds of power with those who dismiss him? How does that work? What can we do? What we can do is work with the God who's already at work in the world. We can choose to do works of kindness, to sow seeds of hope, to help our neighbor in need, not to show how awesome we are for approval, but in response to that undeserved love that God has already shown us in Jesus Christ. God works through people of faith who say, "Yes, God, I'm going to help you out. I hear your call, and I'm going to act." Why didn't Jesus do much work in his hometown? Because people dismissed him as no big deal. And they said, "We're not really going to work with you." But we, as Christ followers, have a chance to show others through what we do just what Jesus' love means for us. Even though we're just from Buffalo. Sometimes I think Buffalo folks downplay themselves. Buffalonians are a bit self-deprecating. "Oh, we don't do too much. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it." But I'd like to say to you, dear members of Crossroads, that having been with you for 2 years, I am continually impressed by the ways that you continue to say, "Yes, I'll help you, God. We volunteer to work with you, God." I see you say yes to God by making sandwiches to feed hungry neighbors, by collecting and bagging up baby clothes for mothers and fathers who need a little bit of help, by cleaning up a corner of God's creation with water keepers or through other organizations. And you show others the love that God showed you by collecting food for kids who are hungry in our neighborhood, in our zip code. And you do it in many other ways that I don't see. But I know that you are working with God to help neighbors near and far. And even though we downplay it, it's no big deal when we do good work because Christ loved us, there's a word for sharing love that we don't deserve. And that word is grace. Now, even though, as Jerry pointed out, the Apostle Paul was a little confusing today, he did remind us that no matter what afflicts us, God's grace is sufficient. No matter what is happening, no matter what you've seen or not seen, God has given us love we don't deserve. God has given us grace. And we can say yes to that grace by sharing it with others. This Tuesday, we have the opportunity to share grace with our neighbors. We could take those bags, those little grocery bags, and put them on doorknobs around the neighborhood. And we can say, please help us make a difference in the lives of others in our community. We'll be demonstrating grace to our hungry neighbors and showing our neighbors here that this is how Christians love, how Lutherans love our neighbors, by collecting food for them. Just as Jesus, knowing that spreading the good news of God's grace was important, sent out his disciples 2 by 2, we'll ask you to go 2 by 2, sent to share grace with our neighborhood. Why do you think Jesus sent people 2 by 2? I think it's because we don't do church alone. We don't do grace alone. Church is a community. We do this together. We partner with each other, and we partner with God, who is already at work in the world to do what Christ has called us to do. And again, we don't put bags on doors asking for food just for us. We don't do it to show how awesome we are as a church and all the good we can do. We don't do it even to get people to come to church. We share grace. We love each other. We feed the hungry because God calls us to love our neighbor. Jesus calls us to help each other. We do it because God so loved the world that he sent Jesus to love us in life and in death and in resurrection. We share grace because we have been graced. So I will admit that when I think of our project on Tuesday to ask people to help us out, my cynical side, which sometimes is pretty loud, says this won't work. People don't care. They'll reject us. What's the point? They might think, like those from Jesus' hometown, that we can't really help. Thankfully, Jesus has something to say about that. When you read the end of the gospel reading from Mark today, Jesus has an answer to my cynicism and my doubt. Jesus sent his disciples with nothing. No supplies, no attachment, no food. The disciples relied on the hospitality of those they met. Jesus trusted. Jesus knew that grace was sufficient. He knew that not everyone was going to be on board with this sort of new way of living, and depending on grace and sharing that grace. So what if they rejected the disciples? What if our neighbors here don't call us back? Jesus said, shake the dust off your feet. Shake it off. But they didn't hear, but they didn't come to church, but they didn't help us out. Shake the dust off your feet. Share the good news with what you have, with what you are. Do good in the world in response to God's love. And if they don't hear you out there, if they don't hear you in your hometown, shake the dust off your feet. Brush it off and keep going. Share love anyway. Feed the hungry anyway. Grace is sufficient in our lives, for our doubts, in our hopes, and in our work. God's love, God's grace is sufficient. We are called to share that grace. Let's answer that call on Tuesday with bags. In the ministry Crossroads continues to do, and wherever we go in our daily lives, we partner with a living God at work in the world, relying on that free, undeserved grace from God. Amen.